Archibald!
Good afternoon, Legionaries. I think I'm recording to you now from the esteemed basin of Libya. I'm doing some contracts here, and it just comes to mind to me as far as what exactly am I doing for the Empire, for Rome? Sitting, sipping my martini amid the ruins of Lepsis Magna have brought forth memories from the past of a time when Rome's power expanded over the whole of the known world. And yet it's gone, like a whisper. Only this faint desert is a testament to its existence and its ruins it's left behind and its planning and so on. And I think to myself, every empire that thinks it will last forever always succumbs, doesn't it? But what is empire? Doesn't it beg the question? How does it work? What is its essence? Is it ethnic? Is it an idea? Is it the ideology? The spirit? How does it impose its will upon others beyond merely strength, military strength, beyond merely inducement and economic inducement? Beyond all that, what is the totality of that mechanism by which empire ultimately not only defeats an enemy, but incorporates him, that subjugates him? What are the mechanisms? Further, what are the mechanisms of empire in our time? It's all very well and good to talk about Rome in the Romo past, but what about Rome now? What about the empires that are emerging? 1991 saw the end of unipolar world orders. We're back to great powers, right? So now we have the PRC as one pole of this international conflict, series of conflicts. We have Russia, another, America, of course, emerging ones within Europe. France is trying to, I guess, jockey its way to prominence inside of the EU and become its own European imperium, so to speak. The Middle East is awash with contending client states. Turkey and Erdogan reviving the Ottoman idea. Saudi Arabia as the leader of all Sunni Islam in that world, jockeying for greater power in general. Or Iran itself for the Shiites, and with its proxy conflicts in Lebanon and so forth. It begs the question, how is it that they are able to reach out across space and time? How are they able to get people of polities with different compositions of ethnic groups? Or, for instance, how are Persians able to reach out to Arabs and find worthy and loyal allies? Well, I think the best way to examine this is to steer clear of the emotional fog of war that descends upon us in this time, where our emotions get in the way of just absolute, abstract, cogent analysis, and to look into the not-so-remote past, but actually just the other decade. The Empire of the Soviet Union. The Empire of the Soviet Union, for many of you who do not know, was this communist, Marxist-Leninist government, right? But it was an empire. An empire being, of course, a polity that encompasses not merely the core ethnic group that composes of the imperial ethnic group, right? So basically, think of a solar system, right? An empire's core ethnic group is the sun. And the more it subsumes, the more planets come into its orbit. Effectively, that is what the relationship of an empire with other ethnic states become. So it revolves around it, right? Therefore, we go back to the world of the Soviet Union, precisely in the modern time, so after 1945. The reason why it is salient is because it is an empire that has expired, of course. Its ideology has largely expired as well. And the technology, or the paradigm under which it was operating, was similar to our own. Electronics, computational technology, basically modern armaments. The idea and the same paradigms that we live under during the Cold War exist today, which is to say great power competitions when it comes to technology, and the time is not so remote, which some of you who don't have much of an imagination might think that it's irrelevant. So many of my esteemed legionaries have come to me and said, why are we talking about ancient history when it doesn't mean anything? It's not related, you see? No, my friend, it's always a perennial truth. The meta exists as a constant. So, to prove it to you, I'm going to present to you the Empire of the Soviet Union. Rest in piss. But alas, we're here to diagnose it, to cut it with a little scalpel, and perform some, some applied after-action reports, where that's to say, we are going to do an autopsy on this empire of bugmen. We're going to take the hive apart and see how it worked. Good to go? Okay. Well, I think the way that we start is by first introducing how it came up to be. The Soviet Union was a revolution which began during the First World War with Lenin at its fore and had its roots in a kind of accumulating tumult of internal civil strife. Before 1917, there was this mutiny called the 1905 Potomacan Mutiny. It's a naval battleship which was taken over by communists. Obviously, it was failed. And then there was Red October and so on, and there are a number of different flashpoints. Stalin was, I guess, a member of the early Communist Party before even it took power, and was effectively a bandit or a brigand. And he would go from shipyard to shipyard, factory to factory, proselytizing, committing bank robberies, killing people, doing X, Y, and Z, and effectively trying to destabilize the Russian Empire and Emperor Nicholas I's reign, and especially came to prominence during the war effort, right? So 1914 to 1917, basically Russia was getting its shit pushed in by Austria-Hungary and Prussia and the Ottoman Empire, and it lost millions and millions of men. It wasn't as successful at I guess, or advanced as its Prussian contemporaries. What's worse is that Russia had a habit of, for instance, not having uniform armaments. It didn't have advanced technology. It relied very strongly on a large strategic depth more than anything. And that is fundamentally what happened. And ultimately, I think it's really important that you understand that the reason why the Soviets came to power was because the central government was weak after 5 years of basically constant international warfare and internal warfare. Let's skip through the part where 1922, Lenin basically wins 2 series of wars, right? The first one is against the Tsarist regime and the White Army, which is including the Liberal Democrats and a number of other bourgeoisie, quote-unquote, factions. And then later he vanquishes the Mensheviks, which are the socialists, or I wouldn't say Trotskyites, but they're basically to the right of the Bolshevik faction. The Bolshevik faction stood for Marxism and the dictatorship of the proletariat, whereas the others, they were more focused on pan-leftism, anarchism, socialism, basically pinkoism. So these are reds, not pinkos, right? And so finally, Lenin consolidates his control. It was a shit show in the early Soviet Union. 1929, he effectively succumbs to his congenital disease, and Stalin succeeds him. This is the beginning of the Stalinist era. Stalin is in power all the way through the 30s, through the 40s, and the 50s, and dies in 56, I believe. Ultimately, it was a time of great purges and great tumults. It's something similar or akin to the great cultural, or rather the Great Leap and the Cultural Revolution in China, but different. This was the time of mass gulags, where guilt of association made your entire family die, or be condemned to life, or 20 years to hard labor in Siberia, which was itself a death sentence. And so, anyway, long story short, Stalin dies. He's inherited, or the empire, quote unquote, the dictatorship is inherited by the what's called the Khrushchev era. Khrushchev goes on, and so, Khrushchev dies, and then finally, some way along the line, I'm not going to go through all the different figureheads, but at the end, Gorbachev comes to power, and through glasnost and perestroika, which is concurrently openness and liberalization, the Soviet Union comes apart. Now, to most people, they think the Soviet Union came apart because of money. Effectively, America was outspending or forcing the Soviets into such a position where their economy was stagnating, and therefore killing the interest of the citizen body in, thinking that the Soviet Union had something to offer them. And there is some logic to this, but really what was happening was the fact that the Marxist-Leninist dirigible economy could not cope with the demands of a civilian economy or consumer economy. What we assume, you and I, is a normal economy, which usually correlates with the demand and supply of very basic things such as cars, homes, food, water, luxury items, everything that can be sold. Effectively, it couldn't cope because the Marxist-Leninist dirigible economy was built on basically like, okay, Dmitry, at the end of this year, we will be creating X product, let's say boots, of this specific kind, in this specific quantity, and it must go out to every citizen. That's great, but not every individual wants a pair of boots. Not every individual, worse still, wants that specific type. They want something better, or X, Y, and Z. And really what's happening is it's a basic situation where the cart is being put before the horse, okay? Where we are trying to forecast economic outcomes before their synthesis or what it is exactly that they're necessitating comes to the fore. I know this doesn't really make sense, and that's okay, because luckily enough, we are not an economic page, nor are we a forum or, I don't know, bunch of scribblers. We're warriors. So just long story short, the idea is that it's basically a war economy. Okay? In a war economies work because you know exactly how many tanks you need, because we know that there are only a limited amount of tanks, and in the army, in the military in general, you can standardize things. You can tell people that, okay, you will have this type of boot, you will have this uniform, you will have X, Y, and Z equipment, not only so that way we have interchangeable parts, but also that we're uniform and have greater cohesion. There are a lot of weak people out there that simply want a life whose priorities are entirely materialistic. And what's worse about Marxist-Leninism is that its whole ideology is predicated on a philosophy which the only reality that exists is material reality, and therefore all goodness of life is material goodness. And so it's kind of setting itself up for failure, because what ended up happening was Marxism promised a place and time where there would be such a surplus of goods and consumer goods of all kinds, of all wants, that there would be no more need for capitalism. There would be no more need for work, aside from what one wanted to do. And of course that never worked out. And that capitalism was better at fulfilling the ends of Marxism than Marxism was, or Marxist-Leninism was, in practice. And so a lot of the ideology was undermined because its promise, right, of material plenty was better suited, or rather better fulfilled, by the rival ideology of liberalism. Now, there are two mistakes, right? So the first mistake is obvious, that it couldn't follow through on its promises. The second mistake is making those promises in the first place, or rather that type of promise. As if material plenty is everything that's worth in this life. That's as if it's the only thing worth fighting for. And so it made two mistakes, and this is why fundamentally nations are not predicated on the material. Because the material, just like the weather, it comes and it goes. Just like the season, there's high season and low season. Life is changeable. Just like Heraclitus says, life is war. Life is conflict. The tides of war come and go. The tides of life come and go. Prosperity comes and it goes. In America, we're headed towards a time of abject poverty. In 100 years from now, America will not be what it once was in the 1950s. And so when you predicate your ideology, aka religion, your spiritual vocation, your ends, your raison d'etre, on how much crap you can fill your little pathetic apartment with, or how good your Lamborghini could be, well, my friend, you're setting yourself up for failure. The only thing that you can effectively manage is what is inside your soul and your choices, right? This is why religion is so powerful, because religion ultimately is a kingdom of heaven. It is a kingdom inside the mind, inside the soul. It is not outside. Okay? So I don't want to get too deep into it, but it's important for you to understand this dynamic, that a polity is three things. Okay? First, it is the ideology, also known as the state religion, or rather just religion in general. Okay? In ancient times and prehistorical times, all polities were their religions and vice versa. There was no cleaving. Okay? It's really important that you understand that this cannot be dispensed with. There is no such thing as a secular state. In the United States, there is no division between church and state. The church for a liberal country is liberalism itself. It is the ideology itself that is a stronger impetus to action than anything. When you think to yourself, well, America has a ton of different religions, yeah, but the content of those religions have been scooped out and replaced with whatever mumbo-jumbo is amenable to the central pole of what Enlightenment thinkers want you to believe. Even though a lot of the beliefs within said religions, Islam, Christianity, are very much at odds with the religion of our community. Now, I personally don't care, but I'm just trying to lay this out for you, that ultimately there's no such thing as a state or secular state religion or a secular state. There is the state. It is its own religion. It is a religion itself. And for people to be loyal to it and to love it and to have, willing followers, leaders, workers, people have to be bought into the idea of it, right? The idea matters. Spirituality matters. Secondly, the ethne, or the ethnic component, right? This is what is called, for instance, in the Soviet Union, the core ethnic group were the Russians. And this is why you see a lot of DOD talkers talk about the ethnic core being this, how do you say, this ethnic, I guess, representative of the general Soviet Empire, right? That they felt to themselves that communism, it wasn't a communist state, it was a Russian state that was calling itself communist. There's some truth and some falsehood to that, and obviously I think you legionaries should understand that there are some differentiation, right? So there's the imperial ideology, an ideology that is transnational, trans-ethnic, but has an ethnic component. And I think the Soviet Union, in due course, I will explain to you how exactly that works. Anyway, so there is, to recap, so far, there is the state religion, the ideology, and then second, there is the ethnic component of that state polity. Third, there is the economic component of that state. So how is it that you're able to not simply give goods and services, but think in political economics? So that's to say, coerce people to do things, have a police state to harm people and to make people go along with force people's compliance, in addition to induce them with material compliance. Okay, think economics. In America, the way that we do it is that we have local police and national federal forces, police, to maintain order and enforce the law. But also we have the promise and the ability to offer basic goods and services, right? And this means food, water, shelter, increasingly in developed countries that are able to attain these standards. It means having access to a thriving economy that you're able to actually make a living for yourself, and so on. So basically, these are the three main elements of a polity. And for the third time, I'll repeat them just in short order. It's the ideology, the ethnic, and the economic, right? So the ethnic and the economic are probably figure large, but ideology is something that we really conflate things with, okay? Now, I have this book, this great book, which I'll link in the, this transmission below. It's written by Edward Luttwak, and it's called The Grand Strategy of the Soviet Union. Now, the title is a little bit misleading because the subject matter being discussed inside this book is all-encompassing. It talks about ideology. It talks about the history of the Soviet state. It talks about its military, its innovations, its expansion, its dynamics, its current deployments. At the time of his writing, which was 1981, or his publication, the Soviet Union had just done a coup d'état and just occupied 2 years in Afghanistan. And this was a war that lasted 10 years for Afghanistan and ultimately resulted in the Soviet defeat in 1989. However, it's important that you understand from the perspective of this book, which was published in 1981, it didn't know that. Okay, so it was a book written in the midst of the Cold War, and unfortunately, this book hasn't been out in circulation for a long time. I suppose it has to do with the fact that it is a little bit dated, but its dating is good because it almost is like a secondary or maybe even a primary source when it comes to reflecting on the litmuses and the ideology, the zeitgeist, the perspectives of the time. But it will teach us a lot about the interplay of those three forces: ideology, ethnics, and the economic factors of a state, so coercion and inducement. But without further ado, I just wanted to read you a passage so that way you get maybe a better feeling for what this book really is. All right, legionaries, let's do it. What is the Soviet Union? Unless we accept the Soviet claim that Lenin's coup d'etat gave birth to an entirely new state, and indeed to a new era in the history of mankind, we must recognize in today's Soviet Union the old empire of the Russians, the only European empire that still survives. In a Darwinian vein, it might be said that when nationalism came to dominate the political attitudes of mankind in Europe first and in the whole latter, the Russian Empire survived and prospered because Lenin and the Bolsheviks imposed upon it a transnational ideology at a time when all the other empires were going into dissolution for want of a similar remedy. Lenin can therefore be seen as the only logical successor of the Tsars. Constitutional Democrats, Social Democrats, and all manner of others, including even the Tsars, might still rule the Russians themselves. But in the new era of nationalism, only a transnational dictatorship could preserve the empire. By accepting national sentiments as legitimate, but only within cultural bounds, after first decisively subordinating all ethnic priorities to the worldwide class struggle. The ideology that Lenin brought to power could justify the refusal to grant independence to each of the many nations of the empire. And this was a refusal that an efficient dictatorship could forcefully impose, as it still does. The largest empire known in history is thus preserved almost intact till this day, while only memories of the smallest fragments remain of the Habsburg, British, French, Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese empires, which ruled much of the world in the days when Lenin came to power. But of course the true successor of the Tsars was Stalin rather than Lenin, because during Lenin's tenure transnational communism remained the true ideology, which meant, of course, that the Russians and their power were supposed to serve the interests of worldwide communism. It was Stalin who turned the proposition right around by first establishing a clear priority for Soviet state interests over the worldwide revolutionary cause, socialism in one country, and then going on to exploit for all they were worth the powerful loyalties that transnational communism could attract to serve the interests of the empire of the Russians. By so doing, Stalin became the prudent keeper and successful aggrandizer of the Tsar's inheritance, as his successors remain till this day, a fact of great consequence in setting limits to the attractions of dissidents inside the Soviet Union as far as the Russians themselves are concerned. So, just quick break here, let me just tell you something. So, for instance, during the Spanish Civil War, it was Stalin himself who broke with the other leftists that were fighting for the Spanish Republic against the Spanish monarchy, and insisting that the gold reserves in the control of the Spanish Republic be immediately transferred to the Soviet Union forthwith, and that anyone not aligned to the Stalinist faction in the Spanish Civil War were themselves fascists, who they were, of course, fighting other fascists. So this kind of infighting was actually one of the reasons why the Spanish Civil War went entirely one way, which is to say, to the side of the Spanish nation, right? And not the other way around. I returned to read... I'm sorry. I just got tear gassed by General Haftar. It's a party trick. We've been getting a bit too hammered, and my throat's been a little bit under attack. But I read again. God damn it, Haftar. Anyway, I read Luttwak once again. Of the role of ideology as one of the instruments of Soviet strategy, more will be said below. But in view of the unfortunate persistence of our sterile debates on the matter, it is immediately necessary to confront the issue of ideological motives in Soviet conduct. It is not illegitimate to draw a direct comparison between transnational communism and the Soviet Empire on the one hand, and missionary Christianity, and the Byzantine Empire on the other hand. We know that the rulers of Constantinople exploited the gains of missionary Christianity to promote the interests of their empire whenever and wherever they could, even while being perfectly sincere in their own devotion to the creed. That men can both truly believe in an ideology and yet seek to use it to enhance their own temporal power seems paradoxical only to outsiders. To the protagonists themselves, there is no contradiction. Their solid justification is that the greater their power, the greater is their ability to protect and disseminate the true faith. Interesting, isn't it? Because a further deduction could be made. America and liberalism. Do you not see that America is the harbinger of all liberalism in the world? It is the world hegemon, the cultural hegemon, the potentate and economic hegemon. Is it not true that everywhere we go, into the third world and beyond, the State Department, especially in Afghanistan and Iraq, is always putting imperatives upon itself to be transporting American liberalism abroad? I mean, think about it. Isn't that why we were pushing weird feminist LGBT stuff in Afghanistan? Even in a place that was just absolutely historically against it. Especially during the times of communism before, which they went to civil war over, and then finally, of course, fought us the liberals, right? The American liberals. I'm not a liberal, but the American liberals. Think of the Byzantine Empire, which is actually probably the best example that Luttwak could have given. It's perfect. So, as you guys probably know, Christianity before Protestantism was split down roughly in two halves. The Eastern Orthodox Christianity that observed the Nicene Creed, of course, and had an autocephalous church, which is to say each country had their own Caesaro-Papist head of the church that was answerable, of course, to the ecumenical patriarch, but roughly speaking, he was free to interpret canon and the spiritual needs of his people on a federative basis, right? It's a federation. The Latin Church, on the other hand, saw itself as fundamentally the head of all temporal powers, and that ultimately it was a theocratic state, and that all states derived their powers from the Pope himself. This came into being with Pope Leo X, like strongly, and of course Pope Urban II really reinforced this. But the dynamic was different, and there was this constant contention between the Eastern churches, the Eastern sees, and the Latin Pope, right? Because there are 5 major churches of the early Christian church. First was Antioch, Alexandria, Jerusalem, and then Rome. And then when Rome was transferred as an important center of Christianity and the Roman Empire, so Constantine the First, right, Constantine the Great, he moved and created the See of Constantinople, which itself he ordered a number of different holy relics from all over the Christian world to be centralized there, just like his temporal state was. And so the Constantinople's see, that ecumenical patriarch, his seat of power remained. And so 5 came into being. And so the story was this constant tension between East and West. The Slavs, for instance, they were all under the sway of the Orthodox, because not only were they most proximate to Constantinople, but they gave the most, cultural impulses and aids. For instance, St. Cyril and St. Basil were sent as missionaries to places as far afield as the Bohemian kingdom, which we now call Czechia. And it was they who were the ones that translated or transliterated Slavonic into a script, so Cyrillic, right? They gave them a script where previously they didn't have one. And similarly, Latin missionaries would do the same. And so this is not to say that the Constantinian Emperor Constantine was not a devoted Christian, but he was able to leverage these cultural and ideological, and which is why, by the way, I reinforce the idea that ideology is religion, because at that time their ideology was religion as we conceive of it. But what I'm trying to say is that for them, that religion, that ideology, they were true believers as well as cynical, quote-unquote, and Machiavellian exploiters of those connections they made from states abroad who had aligned themselves with the Byzantines. In fact, there was this entire fucking crazy beef that happened between the East and the West for the longest time. And, it had to do with Bohemia being switched back over to the Holy Roman Emperor, who converted them to Latin Christianity, Catholicism as you know it, and all this kind of stuff. I don't want to get into it, but the way that medievals thought about religion is the way that us moderns think about ideology. Okay? And that is really the spiritual premise of everyone in the West. Especially if you're a mainline Christian or whatever, or like a Muslim in America. The churches here in America are hollowed out because they basically propagate the religion of the state, which is to say they are satellites of the wider true religion, the civic religion, right? Much in the same way that the Russian Orthodox Church became subjugated during the Soviet Union to Marxist-Leninist ideologies, which is to say they reinvented the Russian Orthodox Church so that it only reflected the good, right, the state-approved themes within Christianity, and completely forgot or cut out, excised all that which was against the Marxist-Leninist interpretation of the world. But I get ahead of myself, but it's really important that you understand this dynamic of ideology. But I return to the reading here. Certainly, the Byzantine record suggests that it is unprofitable to speculate on the personal devotion of the rulers who so assiduously promoted the faith, and that it is quite futile to try to distinguish between ideological and state political motives in their policies. Every religious act was meant to strengthen the state against its temporal enemies, internal and external, and every political act was meant to sustain the true faith in a world filled with unbelievers and heretics. The same, incidentally, was true of Tsarist Russia. Thus, for example, during the later 19th century, the Tsars assiduously promoted the proselytization of the Russian Orthodox Church inside the Ottoman Empire, and especially in Palestine, where it grew greatly, but at the expense of Greek Orthodoxy. Was this effort motivated by religious considerations alone? Or was the Russian Missionary Church an arm of Russian foreign policy in the competition with the British, French, and Germans for influence of the Levant? To show that the Byzantines or the Russians under the Tsars could frequently ignore the religious aspect of things in their dealings with foreign unbelievers or heretics proves nothing, because the emperors could validly claim that it was a question of survival for them to do so, and that the state that would thus survive was the only guarantor of the safety of the true church in the first place. To show by documentary evidence that it was the court that financed Byzantine missionaries, or that the Tsar's foreign ministry paid for the churches, monasteries, hospitals, and schools that were built in such great numbers in Ottoman Palestine, again proves nothing. Because the emperor was the head of the Byzantine Church, just as the Tsar's foreign ministry belonged to a government which was itself the official protector of the Russian Orthodox faith. And it's kind of interesting because during the 16th century, the 17th century, the French actually, at the height of Christian Catholic fervor, they allied with the Mohammedan Empire under the Ottoman Sultan against their common enemy, the Protestants, and the Habsburg Empire. Interesting. And simultaneously, you hear a lot of contemporary accounts from the Gallic Church, which is what is called the Catholic Gallic Church, right, in France, of justifications claiming that the Habsburgs were heretics and that ultimately it was the lesser of two evils to leverage political power from a true apostate power than it was to rub shoulders with heretics against a common foe. This, of course, came as maybe a consequence, or maybe even, I would say, as a result of the Westphalian peace, which increasingly, quote-unquote, secularized the relations of states between each other, and that ultimately really cleaved Europeans along religious lines which had resulted from the 30 Years' War, right? The 30 Years' War being a war between Protestants and Catholics over Martin Luther and so on and so forth. I continue reading from Luttwak again. Similarly, in our days, the Soviet Union loudly protested against the imprisonment of Egyptian communists under Nasser and the executions of Sudanese communists under Numeri. It might seem that a purely state-motivated diplomacy would have refrained from such intrusive protests. But in both cases, it can also be argued persuasively that it was precisely for diplomatic reasons and not because of any pure ideological solidarity that complaints were made. For in both cases, the protest was most convenient. In Nasser's regard, forcefully to remind him of his debt to the Soviet Union, and with Sudanese, much later to provide justification for the Soviet liaison with Libya. Especially revealing is the record of Soviet relations with Iraq, whose successive dictators have had close connections with Moscow even while persecuting and indeed exterminating Iraqi communists from time to time. Ever since the overthrow of the monarchy in July 1958, the Soviet Union, under a variety of agreements, has supplied Iraq with arms, including large numbers of high-profile weapons such as battle tanks and combat aircraft of modern design. Over the years, the Soviet Union and Iraq have cooperated in a variety of military joint ventures and formal agreements signed between the two countries, including the 15-year Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation of April 1972. And yet, during the same period, the attitude of Iraq's rulers to their local communists has altered from grudging toleration up to their inclusion in the government at cabinet level, all the way down to outright massacre. And no obvious correlation can be established at all between the ups and downs in Soviet-Iraqi relations and the abrupt changes in the government's treatment of the Iraqi Communist Party. When the sufferings of their Iraqi comrades were brought to the attention of Soviet leaders by French and Italian communists, the Kremlin's self-justification was identical to the Byzantine argument, namely that worldwide enhancement of the faith sometimes imposes the cruel necessity of disregarding the welfare of some of its immediate representatives, and of course, the Kremlin would no more accept a distinction between the interests of the state and those of the faith which the state upholds than the rulers of Byzantium would have done. Yes, Byzantiums, yes. See how they attack me? They Havana ray my brain. Anyway, I'm not hammered enough for this, but what I'm trying to tell you is this. If you can draw the illusions of the Soviet Union in that circumstance, with, for instance, during the Cold War, the late Cold War, the Stay Behind movement, right, which is basically Operation Gladio, which was NATO's close alliance and utilization of fascists, Nazis, and other far right-wing elements in Europe and abroad to buttress or utilize them for liberal aims against the communists, right? And this is really important because politics is a matter of not missing the forest for the trees. It was apt for the Byzantines to look the other way when Assyrian churches under, let's say, the caliphate of the Sunni caliphate of in Baghdad were persecuted. It was smart of, let's see here, Russians to look the other way when certain Ottoman Christians were persecuted. And at other times it was useful to use that persecution for their own political ends. Further, in our time, is it not interesting that liberals in general, inside the Soviet Union, or what has become the Russian Federation, have been either cast away or championed based on the political interests of liberals hegemon of our time, which is to say, when it suits the American government. Similarly, the Byzantines, for instance, would often contract mercenaries, Muslim mercenaries from the east to fight in the west. Later, the Russians would contract Uyghurs and other Muslim minority ethnicities within the Russian Empire to fight on their behalf, a ostensibly Orthodox country. Further, isn't it interesting also that liberal America is willing to leverage far-right people for use against a common enemy? Think, of course, Ukraine. Ultimately, these are all very interesting and, how do you say, strong examples of not missing the forest for the trees, understanding the iron rule of oligarchy, and that ultimately it is the rulers themselves who are able to quote-unquote compromise on their faith or whatever to not miss the forest for the trees and to ally themselves with people who are weaker than them, who are, frenemies for their own aims. And in circumstances like that, where there are alliances between people who would otherwise be enemies, it is always the stronger partner that benefits. Okay? So, so people think that you can't really ally with America if you're not a liberal and not be taken advantage of, and vice versa. You have to make constant political claims, etc., or you have to really drive a hard bargain, which doesn't happen, right? For instance, Ukraine, it started off with like a bunch of seats in the right, nationalist, Banderist, or whatever, and now it has none. Before, there were, a bunch of nationalists in the street or whatever with, let's say Azov Battalion, and they had very clear iconography, and these were the guys that were used as vanguard units, which is to say they get chewed up, they get fucked up, they get killed. They're useless. They're penal battalion type individuals. And what's worse is they act to actually tone down their iconography. So, for instance, they got their new symbol from a Western PR, social media PR firm. And then basically it looks nothing like what it was before, which is a stylized, whatever. You can look it up yourself. I'm not going to say here just to get banned off of the transmission. But what I'm trying to tell you is that ultimately it should be instructive to you. Don't be a sucker, okay? And ultimately it's state actors, people with very real entrenched power that are always the ones capable of getting the better of their clients or their frenemies who are of lesser power. Okay, so I think people really don't understand that, and this is why we're examining the Soviet Union, because we're able to dispassionately view them through a paradigm of history, of things that have died already and ossified, and very few are ardent adherents of Marxist-Leninist communism specifically, right? I mean, there are communists everywhere, right? But this brand specifically died a long time ago, and there are very few people that get all heated about it. So we're able to look at it objectively, just in the same way that we're able to look at classical antiquity with objectivity, or at least more dispassionately, okay, and objectively than before. Okay, we're not Romans back in the day, we're Romans here and now, okay, got it? Check. No, I'm still getting heated, dude. No, bullshit. I get heated about that whole thing with Sulla. Sulla did nothing wrong, okay? Marius was some bullshit, commie crap. Sulla said it right. I'm still heated about that. Anyway, we return to the book now. I'll read again from Luttwak. Okay, this is a new section, and this is the question of nationality. So the first one was really addressing the ideology aspect. Remember, there were 3 sections, 3 components of what makes a polity, its power, and so on, its constituencies. Well, we're talking about now the second component, which is nationality, aka ethnicity, the ethnic question. And Luttwak talks about that from a geopolitical, political standpoint. Listen closely, legionaries. Lenin and his party seized power over the Soviet state by an act of force. and their Bolshevik regime immediately had to struggle against domestic and foreign foes by brutal repression and war. Nevertheless, it was the firm belief of the early leaders that once tranquility was restored, education widely promoted, and a modest prosperity achieved, their ideology and rule would find genuine acceptance throughout the lands that Moscow controlled. Had that hope been realized, today's Soviet state would be a consensual union of nationalities linked by a common ideology, even if the dictatorship of each national communist party would have to continue till the advanced stage of communism is finally achieved, when the state structure itself will wither away. In other words, the Soviet state was supposed to evolve into a voluntary confederation. The independence willingly conceded to Finland, and rather less willingly to the 3 Baltic states, was a tangible manifestation of this early attitude. And indeed, the nominal right of each national republic to become independent has been reaffirmed in successive Soviet constitutions, if only to remain a dead letter, like so much else in those documents. It was neither Lenin's terror nor Stalin's that precluded the emergence of a genuine transnational state, but rather the primacy gradually accorded to the Russian nationality within the Soviet Union. Lenin had consistently treated Russian nationalism as the chief domestic antagonist of his creation. Oh! Does that not sound familiar? Maybe you could maybe think about that from an American perspective. Who's our president's #1 enemy right now? Who's the zeitgeist, the boogeyman? The guy who's gonna suck your toes in the middle of the night in your corner. What's he doing? Who's that guy, huh? Alright, we get back here. It was not by accident, as Pravda might say, that the most sensitive positions in charge of internal security, propaganda, and war were at first filled by Estonians, Poles, Jews, Finns, Georgians, and so on. It was only natural, after all, that small and weak nationalities would be especially responsive to a transnational creed that would place all on equal footing. Russian nationalism, on the other hand, was inseparable from Tsardom and the Church, and indeed it had shaped the worldview of the official class of the old regime. But once Bolshevik state was duly organized with a large and growing bureaucracy, its economic apparatus, and its state services, military and social, it was inevitable that the more educated peoples within the USSR would lead the less advanced in the implementation of socialism in the economy, in education, and in the entire structure of the new totalitarian state. And once the Finns, Estonians, Lithuanians, and Latvians all became independent, it was the Russians themselves who remained the most advanced nationality of any size inside the Soviet Union. In the beginning, therefore, the primacy of the Russian people within the Soviet Union was the unavoidable reflection of the achievements and qualifications of individual Russians, and thus unchallengeable. The mass of teachers and managers, bureaucrats and soldiers, party leaders, and publicists could obviously be supplied only by the educated class, which happened to be predominantly Russian. Since Russian nationalism as such was still very much in disfavor, and since cultured elements from all other nationalities could and did share fully in this primacy, which was then still a professional rather than a national phenomenon, there was no contradiction between the transnational ideology and the clear predominance of ethnic Russians in all leading roles. Now you can make allusions to the early American Republic, which ostensibly was open to every man, that all men were created equal, and that ultimately the aristocratic meritocracy would rule, and that could come from anyone. It could be anyone. You see, everyone has a soul. And so, in a country, in the early Republic, where the majority of people in general were of, I guess, Anglo-Saxon descent, it was no contradiction for the ruling elite to ultimately be Anglo-Saxons in America. But they started to choke on their words when the ethnic composition of this transnational imperial state did not reflect the values that it espoused, right? And this is the crux or the paradigm that we find ourselves under, right? And this is the question of our time, okay? Okay? No, but I go too far. But what I'm trying to tell you, Legionaries, is this is why we're in the crunch that we're in right now. Okay, so be aware and try to transpose these examples to us and see how we are an empire, and so on and so forth. You got to be actively reading. You can't just be passively understanding. I continue reading. It was under Stalin that the transformation of a professional primacy into a national supremacy took place. Well before the German invasion of June 1941, Stalin began to appeal, if only in a carefully controlled degree, to the loyalties and the Russian nationalism could still evoke for the ruler who held the Kremlin, whether Tsar or Commissar. Funny. When the German war began, it became clear almost immediately that the Red Army was disastrously outclassed. All restraints were then removed, and everything possible was done to identify the regime with the Russian motherland. To do so was a necessity of war, or at least it must have seemed so at the time, for Stalin could scarcely have foreseen that the Germans would themselves provide the most ample incentives for fierce resistance by soldiers and partisans, Russian and non-Russian alike, by their immense brutalities. For the revolutionary Soviet state, the abrupt reversion to symbols, language, and emotions of Russian nationalism was itself revolutionary. Once repudiated as class enemies and imperialists, the successful fighting figures of the Russian past were quite suddenly restored to heroic status and greatly celebrated in print, on film, and in that characteristic Bolshevik medium, the large wall poster. The Russian motherland became once again a fitting subject of veneration, as a mystic entity rather than one merely geographic, and even the Russian Orthodox Church was accorded a new and much higher status, not as a spiritual institution, of course, but at least as a national one. Moscow, it seems, was worth a good many liturgies, and also the several seminaries reopened and the many churches restored to churchly use. So before this, the church was outlawed, right? Christianity was seen as a handmaiden to bourgeois elites and an opiate of the masses. So when the Soviets came to power, all churches were forcibly closed, their wealth seized, priests killed, nuns raped, murdered, whatever, and Christianity lived in this twilight until it became useful again, you see. It became useful. I read again. The great military leaders and great Tsars of the Russian past, Suvorov and Kutuzov, Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great, Alexander Nevsky and Ivan Kalita, were powerful but dangerous allies for Stalin and the party. Those names, and all that went with them, by implication, namely the empire building of the Russians, could be just as irritating to the sensitivities of non-Russians as they were a source of pride and loyalty for the ethnic Russians themselves. It is one thing to speak of Cromwell or Kitchener among the English, quite another to remember their names in the company of Irishmen or Afrikaners. Historians of the Second World War have generally seen fit to praise Stalin's restoration of Russian nationalism to official favor, giving him credit for flexibility and guile, especially since the man who thus restored to the Russians their history and national pride was himself a Georgian. Above all, it is taken for granted that the nationalist restoration was necessary to sustain the Soviet war effort. But since it is now known that in virtually every non-Russian ethnic group in the USSR that came under German occupation, there was a very widespread willingness to collaborate with the new power in the land, and among the Russians too at first. It is difficult to say whether Stalin's maneuver was truly successful. If it is reasonable to believe that the Russians fought better for their own ethnic motherland than for the abstract entity of the Soviet Union, it is just as likely that the non-Russians were alienated by the nationalist restoration, which inevitably made them into less than first-class citizens. Certainly the fact that the German army reached most of the non-Russians only in the summer of 1942, by which time the new nationalist propaganda was going full blast, and that the Germans found many willing collaborators among them, including tens of thousands of volunteers for the Waffen-SS, is a matter of historical record. As for the true impact of the nationalist campaigns on the fighting morale of the Russians themselves, that too is difficult to judge because German atrocities must have had a far more powerful impact than any number of nationalist articles and books, films, or posters. But if the necessity and net value of the nationalist restoration must remain in doubt, what is perfectly clear is that it was an admission of failure. In spite of 20 years of consolidation and pervasive propaganda, the Soviet state had failed to attract enough loyalty to be defended for what it was, or so at least its leader believed. Faced with the crisis of the German invasion and the enormous defeats of the summer of 1941, the Soviet state had to assume the protective disguise of the Russian motherland. In view of what has happened since then, it might rather be said that the original transnational Soviet Union was in fact defeated in 1941 and that it surrendered to Mother Russia in preference to surrendering to the Germans. That clearly was the better alternative, but it was a surrender all the same. Just as nationalism is normally a cohesive force in nation-states, it must be a divisive in states that contain many different nationalities. The nationalist restoration that pleased so many Russians in 1941 pleases them still, must have been just as displeasing to non-Russians, and it still is. Ideologically, a powerful contradiction was engendered between the official transnational creed and the Kremlin's elevation of the Russian people to a quasi-official supremacy over all other nationalities. Politically, a fundamental tension was created between the multinational composition of the state and the primacy accorded to just one of the nationalities. Having triumphantly survived the advent of the national idea by issuing the promissory note of a transnational future, the Soviet Union thus began to default on the payments in 1941, right? Emotional payments. Given the circumstances of the time, however, the creditors could do little to press their claims. For one thing, ethnic Russians, with largely assimilated Belarusians, then still accounted for a good majority of the total population of the USSR. And many other people of diverse ethnic backgrounds, notably many Jews and the educated, westernized elements among more backward nationalities, also identified with the Russians. In any case, the Muslim peoples of Soviet Central Asia and the Caucasus were then still so backward, and their identity was defined by family, tribe, clan, and religion rather than nationality. In other words, they were in a pre-nationalist stage. Finally, the more advanced nationalities in today's Soviet Union, the Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians of the Baltic states, and the Poles, Ruthenians, and Ukrainians of the western Ukraine were not in the Kremlin's keeping at all until after the reoccupation and annexations that came at the end of the Second World War. In the latest 1979 census, by contrast, ethnic Russians accounted for no more than 52.4% of the population. Even if one adds the heavily assimilated Belarusians, the proportion is still only 56%. It sounds very similar to our circumstances now, right? In the meantime, the general betterment of their circumstances has brought all the peoples of Soviet Central Asia and the Caucasus to the stage of national consciousness, and by a coincidence most unfortunate for their rulers, this has happened at a time when Islam has once again become a very militant political phenomenon. What census returns cannot measure is the apparently widespread reversion of non-Russian elites from the more backward nationalities to their own distinct national consciousness. It is known that the more educated among the Turkic peoples, Uzbeks, Tatars, Kazakhs, Azeris, Turkmens, Kyrgyz, and Bashkirs, and the Iranian peoples, Tadzik, Ossetians, and Kurds, as well as many smaller ethnic groups, were quite voluntarily becoming Russified during the 1920s and 30s. And by the way, Russification, Americanization, whatever, all of this is basically a way of saying that they imported or used primarily the Russian or American English language. They used cultural icons and identified closely with cultural norms of the host or imperial ethnic state. So this is what they mean by Russification or Americanization and so on. I continue to read. The small minority of educated men and the few educated women of these nationalities were pulled towards the Russian language and Soviet culture by all the attractions of joining the leading nationality and a modern culture, and they were being pushed in the same direction by the fact that their own communities offered little scope for men of modern outlook, while being mostly hostile to emancipated women. At the same time, with transnationalism still dominant in the Kremlin, many elite Armenians, Georgians, and Jews were also becoming self-Russified, if only because a Russian cultural identity was seen as the gateway to high career advancements. To put it crudely, many hoped to emulate the spectacular careers of the Armenian Mikoyan, the Georgian Beria, not to speak of Stalin himself, and such Kremlin Jews as Kaganovich. In, say, 1930, it would have been reasonable to expect that the better educated among the non-Russians could become thoroughly assimilated into the synthetic Soviet identity by, say, 1980. Interesting. Remember, the synthetic American identity, which is to say the synthetic, the American identity that they say it is, right? So these people believe in the post office and the Constitution, you know? This is the fake one, right? That's the parallel here. I read again. This obviously has not happened. On the contrary, a process has been underway that can only be described by the clumsy word disaffiliation. Instead of becoming new Soviet men of Russified outlook, it seems that most Turkic, Iranian, and other minority intellectuals have instead chosen to lead the national consciousness movements of their own peoples. And even the unbelievers among them share in the cultural, if not spiritual, revival of Islam. As for the elite Armenians, Georgians, and Jews who were so eager to Russify themselves in the 1930s, their reversal has been spectacular. Once the leading advocates of transnationalism, the three groups are now equally prominent in the new movement of national reaffirmation. In the case of the Jews, to point of seeking emigration in very large numbers, some 250,000 actually left the USSR between 1967 and 1981, and they, by the way, this is my note, they went to Israel and the United States. This is actually the premise for that movie Lord of War, where the parents of Orlov pretended to be Jews so that they could escape to Brooklyn, and this is where they had their kids and all this kind of stuff, but this is a real historical event and something that happened, so I'm just reiterating here. I'm reading again from the text. And then finally, the peoples absent till 1945, the Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Poles, Ruthenians, Western Ukrainians, and the Moldavians, or Romanians, of annexed Bessarabia, are all now pressing their national claims loudly enough to be heard in the West from time to time. And remember, during the Cold War, you didn't hear crap from the East. Behind the Iron Curtain, you didn't hear anything except for your stray here and there guy that made it through the barbed wire and armed guards of the border. I read again. Larger than any of these, the Ukrainian nationality has also maintained itself as distinct in spite of both centrally imposed Russification and a degree of continuing self-Russification. This is salient, so read and be well prepared to hear what he has to say. I read again. It is impossible to determine to what extent disaffiliation is underway and to what extent voluntary self-Russification still continues, but it is so obvious that if Ukrainians were to reaffirm their distinct national consciousness in the same degree as the Armenians, Georgians, and Jews have done, that would be disastrous from the viewpoint of rulers in the Kremlin. A worldwide trend of ethnic reaffirmation is now obviously in evidence. But it is impossible to avoid the judgment that elite self-Russification has given way to disaffiliation, because non-Russians feel themselves to be much less than equals in the highest ranks of Soviet power elite. Now think about this, just pause. Think about this from the American perspective. And in the American perspective, we give this a racial character, but it's really cultural as well. It's ethnic, right? So what is ethnicity? Ethnicity is the marriage between culture and race, right? That's what we called ethne, the Greek for ethne. Well, here, the dialect of our dialectic of our time is basically people feel as though they can't enter the elite, and they feel disenchanted with the promises of what America can give. And there's an entrenched boomer bureaucracy that wants to make it happen. So in the similar vein, the Soviet Union had these true believers that held on to power and that ultimately could not see it any other way than creating new Soviet men. So they believed in the imperial ideology, even though themselves and their cronies and everyone in the elites were Russians. They were ethnic Russians, especially after Khrushchev. And so we'll continue, but this is something that you have to understand as time goes on. So this is an economic thing, right? And James Burnham talks about this in his book, right? So he talks about the Machiavellians and that the elite has to be somewhat porous, right? So you can allow people to rise to elite status. Because if you ossify the elite, the aristocracy, what happens is that people don't have any hope of making it. And if you have no hope of making it, you have no reason to buy into the system. And if you have no reason to buy in the system, there are always other political actors who are willing to give them everything and more to make it. The Russian Tsars are a great example. They suffered a revolution because they were unable to cope with the fact that their entrenched aristocracy could not allow the lower elements who were people of great merit or power, real power, de facto power, into the higher echelons of power, okay? This disaffected not only the people that were seeking power in that entity, but also people of a softer heart. So, for instance, there are a number of aristocratic women who were subversives, and they were communists, right? And obviously they get raped and murdered in the revolution. Doesn't matter how much they help, but what I'm trying to say is this is a similar pattern that happens where if you are too cruel or brutal in maintaining an elite, not only do you start to disaffect the subject population, but you start to disaffect the weak people within your aristocratic or elite class. Okay? But anyway, we return to the book. Moreover, their elevation in status as the Soviet Union's leading nationality has given the Russians some license for the expression of a sense of superiority over all other nationalities, and this in turn has caused the latter to fall back on their own ethnic identity. In the case of the Jews, it is known that a process of assimilation already well advanced was interrupted and then undone by the revival of Russian anti-Semitism, and indeed its official sanction during the last years of Stalin, and again after 1967. Ultimately, it was inevitable that the public reassertion of Russian national pride would evoke competitive reaction by all other nationalities. A vicious circle has been engendered in which non-Russian hostility stimulates Russian assertiveness, which in turn causes resentment. Right? So they're not very laissez-faire. They're like the basic interaction is basically, let's say, Orlov, I can't make it in your state, Dmitry. And then Dmitry's like, well, fuck you, I don't care. He's like, oh, you're such a bastard. And he's like, oh, fuck you more. And then he beats you in the face. And basically, clearly, that causes resentment. Subjugation causes resentment. And such subjugation works, by the way. But subjugation requires constant repression. In the case of the Roman Empire, for instance, you see this in the Judean Wars, you see this in Gaul, you see this in the Germanic Wars as well, and the constant raids beyond the Rhine. But to return to the modern element, or rather the modern context, it is the case that the Soviet Union did a lot of repression on their own, and we'll see here in the latter of this little chapter here. Stalin had been the party's expert on nationality questions before he rose to supreme power and became the party's expert on all things. He must have been fully aware of the danger that Russian nationalism he unleashed would become powerfully divisive in peacetime. And in fact, even before Berlin fell to his armies, Stalin tried to restore the primacy of class over nationality. He ordered an end to the anti-German campaign and revived the pre-1941 distinction between the Hitlerites and the good working people of Germany. And a serious effort was made to force the Russian nationalist genie back into the bottle. But an increasingly decrepit Stalin could not accomplish that most difficult task, and his successors have lacked the capacity or perhaps the will to do so. It is one thing to recall chauvinistic books and films from distribution, or to cover up Russian nationalist posters with new ones on class struggle themes, and quite another to restore a consistently transnational attitude through a predominantly Russian bureaucracy of immense size. Once the Soviet regime lifted the transnational mask to reveal the features of Russian supremacism, the consequences could not be undone by merely lowering the mask once again. Certainly, the memory must have been indelible among those non-Russians who had truly believed in the transnational promise that Lenin had issued. Besides, the Russians themselves had by then learned a new repertoire of words and attitudes formerly compatible with the official transnationalism, but nationalist and indeed supremacist in tone and substance. Okay, let me pause here for a second. So, if we were to take that illusion that I brought up last time, that example of a solar system, where an empire is a sun and its planets, where the sun is that core ethnic component and the planets are its satellites, what was happening is that the Soviet Union started to affirm the sun, and to the detriment, of course, of the planets. And I understand this kind of illusion is hard to kind of grasp, but you have to see how delicate this balance is. Because clearly empire benefits the core ethne, and it comes at the expense of the satellites, or rather, it could come at the expense. It could be marginally beneficial, but it's never truly in the interests of the subjective class or subjugated class to be part of an empire. You see this in Rome, for instance, of subjugated Gauls and so on, who Romanized themselves, or Jews, for instance, like Josephus, the guy that authored the Judean Wars under Titus Vespasian. Ultimately, he Romanized himself, but it truly wasn't in his interest to be part of the Roman Empire. Anyway, this is getting too ahead of ourselves, but I think it's important that you see that there's this break. This is the second section, and now third, what is happening economically, and the interplay between the economics, so not just simply coercion and material goods and inducements, but the second, which is ethnic representation and the dynamics of ethnic relations within an empire, and the first one, which is ideology, which is to say the state religion, okay, the gravity, the reason why these planets associate with each other. I continue. But there is also a far more fundamental cause for the perpetuation of the nationalist restoration. The Soviet Union's economic failure. Even as late as the early 1960s, Soviet leaders were in the habit of uttering rather specific promises of high living standards to come in the near future. Soviet citizens were then being told that they would live far better in, say, 1980 than their Western European or American counterparts. Had the Soviet economy developed as the Kremlin leaders and a good many others had expected, including those Western economists who were forever comparing high Soviet growth rates with much more modest growth of the United States during the 1950s, the Soviet Union would now be in a position to attract the economically motivated loyalty of Russians and non-Russians alike. So think the United States. Why is it that we were able to command so many people? Because we buy them. Okay, we don't need to rely on our ethnic, or at least this is what liberal elites believe, right? We don't need to rely on our ethnic similarities or ethnic ties and proclivities or gravity, because we can buy people, okay? We can buy people with the capitalist dream. This is where Gordon Gekko, Scarface comes in, right? People fall in love with America because everyone is going to Las Vegas and hitting the big slots, right? So this is why they can induce people into the sham, right? This is what's happening. But the Soviet Union couldn't do that. It was poor. I'll read again. Though living standards have certainly improved, especially for the more backward Central Asian and Caucasian populations, today's Soviet Union cannot possibly present itself as the flag bearer of economic advancement, and for the Russians themselves least of all. They are as well informed of Western standards of living as the advanced Baltic nationalities and the enterprising Armenians, Georgians, and Jews, while at the same time their own standard of living is distinctly inferior. In the absence of bread, circuses must be offered instead, and the most seductive circus of all is the stimulation of Russian national pride. There's an even simpler explanation for the toleration and indeed encouragement of Russian nationalism by the authorities. Today's Soviet rulers are themselves almost all Russians, or Belarusians, in sharp contrast to the truly transnational leadership of Stalin's day, when in the highest echelons of the Kremlin, the Russians were merely one nationality among several. Since the promise of a voluntary transnational confederation has not been realized, and since it obviously cannot be a nation-state, today's Soviet Union must be an empire, that is, a state in which one nationality dominates the homelands of many. In fact, the Soviet Union is the only remaining multinational empire of any consequence, except for the People's Republic of China, where, however, the non-Han nationalities are demographically insignificant, even if their homelands account for a large part of the entire territory. So population-wise, they are inferior, like just fringe peoples, but they might occupy or quote-unquote occupy a large physical landmass, okay? Moreover, since Russification and voluntary self-Russification have been aborted, the Soviet Empire is not and will not become a Russian Empire in the way the Tsar's Empire truly was, or the Roman became. In the days of the Tsars, the non-Russian nationalities mattered so much less in the political realm than in today's Soviet Union. In the Roman case, on the other hand, the political cement of elite Romanization followed very quickly in the wake of territorial conquest. By that process, the empire of the Romans, or more specifically the empire created by the leaders of the city of Rome, became an empire that was Roman only in its public culture, in which elites of diverse ethnic origin could rise to the highest levels of power in all branches of the state. Plainly, that is not the case in today's Soviet Union, where, to the contrary, a multinational revolutionary elite has given way to a Russian bureaucratic elite. With Lenin's promissory note now in default, the Soviet Union finds itself confronted by the very force that dissolved all the other empires that loomed so large in Lenin's day, the national idea, and this time it cannot be fought by any means except for repression, pure and simple. All right. Now let's reflect, legionaries. So the Soviet Union gives us this great opportunity to reflect and to parse out relations as time had gone on, and we can be dispassionate about the relations and trends that happened, right? Because this is a foreign people in a past time, in a dead religion, in a dead place. So we see the relations of how things happen. We see that ethnicity counts for much. Your ability to induce people to material good and coerce them counts for much, in addition to the ideology, the beliefs that we claim. Hence why, if we transpose that to the paradigms of our time, why it's so important for instance, functionaries and liberals of the state to attack people who don't believe in the state ideology, because it is with the state ideology that you're able to create empire. This is Rome, right? Rome had a different ideology. Anyone who, I guess, ameliorated themselves to Roman mores, culture, and gave offerings to Roman gods were considered Romans, and they were enfranchised as such. I mean, think about Caracalla, and all them. So you got to really think about this from our perspective, and it's something that's going to inform how the future will play out for us. As America careens down this economic path of disaster, really, it's going to rely more and more on this specific factor of ideology and coercion. As we saw with the late Soviet Union, However, Legionaries, I am getting too hammered, and I think the future, this is going to be broken down into another session, another transmission. But right now, I have some very beautiful individuals that Haftar sent me as beautiful babes as a sorry thank you note for tear gassing me earlier and fucking up my throat. Me and Sergeant Barnes had to control ourselves in our rage. Anyway, about to get hammered. So this is Lance's Legion. This is Politeia. Sergeant Barnes as always. And General Haftar signing off.